In March of 2008, in a limestone cave nestled into the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a Russian archaeologist named Michael Shunkov and his team pulled a tiny fragment of bone out of a sediment layer they had been carefully excavating for years. It was a piece of a pinky finger, barely large enough to hold between two fingers, unremarkable to look at. Easily the kind of fragment that could sit in a museum drawer for decades without anyone giving it a second thought. Nobody working that dig had any reason to suspect that this single, unremarkable sliver of bone was about to force science to admit that an entire branch of the human family, a full species or subspecies of ancient humans, had been living, breeding, and quietly leaving genetic fingerprints across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years without anyone ever noticing. And the strangest part of that story isn't the finger bone at all. It's the tooth, or rather the teeth, found nearby, that ended up doing more to prove this hidden lineage was real and considerably older and stranger than anyone expected, than the bone ever did. The cave is called Denisova Cave, tucked into a quiet river valley in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, named after a hermit monk known locally as Denis, or Dionysi, who is said to have lived in seclusion there sometime. In the 18th century, long before anyone suspected the ground beneath him held anything of scientific interest at all. By the time Shunkov's team found that finger fragment in 2008, archaeologists had already been steadily working the site for decades, drawn back year after year by its unusually deep, remarkably well-preserved sediment layers, dozens of distinct strata stacked one atop another, each one representing a different slice of time that seemed to promise a longer, more continuous record of ancient human occupation than almost anywhere else across northern Asia. Generations of hominins, and even other species entirely, had apparently used this same cave as shelter, on and off, for hundreds of thousands of years, which is precisely what made it such a magnet for careful, patient excavation long before anyone had reason to suspect it was hiding something this significant. What made the 2008 finger bone different from everything else found there before wasn't its appearance. Morphologically, it was so fragmentary, so worn down and nondescript, that nobody examining it by eye alone could, confidently, say much of anything about who or what it had belonged to. It didn't look dramatic. It didn't look like a discovery. What made it different was what happened 2 years later in 2010, when researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, working under the direction of Svante Pääbo, extracted its mitochondrial DNA and successfully sequenced it. The genetic result didn't match modern humans. It didn't match Neanderthals either, despite the fact that Neanderthals were already well documented in this exact region of Siberia, meaning researchers had every reason to expect a Neanderthal match, and instead got something else entirely. In fact, it matched nothing on record, nothing sitting in any existing genetic database of known hominin populations. Whoever this finger had belonged to represented a population entirely unknown to science, one that had never been given a name, never been assigned a branch on the family tree, and had, up until that exact moment, left no confirmed physical trace anywhere in the fossil record at all, no skull, no jaw, nothing that had ever been recognized for what it truly was. Researchers began referring to this newly identified lineage as the Denisovans, simply after the cave where the evidence had turned up. And almost immediately, specialists across the field started reaching for a specific, evocative label to describe them. A ghost lineage, a population whose existence had been proven unambiguously and mathematically through genetic evidence, well before anyone had anything resembling a complete skeleton, a reconstructed face, or even a confident, working sense of what these people had actually looked like while they were alive. That is an unusual, almost backwards way for an entirely new type of ancient human to enter the scientific record. Normally, the sequence runs in the opposite direction. Someone finds a skull first, argues for years about which species it represents based on its shape and proportions, and only much later, if the preservation conditions ever allow it, manages to extract usable genetic material to finally settle the argument one way or another. With the Denisovans, the DNA came first, decisively and unambiguously, and the physical evidence needed to back it up only trickled in slowly, fragment by fragment, tooth by tooth, across more than a decade of subsequent excavation, which is exactly why the word ghost stuck to them so firmly and for so long. For years, this entire branch of ancient humanity existed almost entirely as a genetic signature, a set of statistical fingerprints scattered quietly inside modern human genomes, and inside a small scattering of teeth, too incomplete and too fragmentary to build any real physical picture from. A presence scientists could prove existed, with mathematical certainty, long before anyone could actually describe what it once looked like. And this is where the teeth actually enter the story, because they turned out to matter every bit as much as that original finger bone, arguably more in confirming that the Denisovans weren't some fluke, some isolated one-off individual whose unusual DNA was a statistical anomaly, but a genuine long-lived population that had occupied this specific stretch of Siberia for an extraordinarily long stretch of time. Alongside the finger bone, researchers had also recovered a handful of teeth from the same cave, excavated across different seasons, some found as early as the year 2000, long before anyone knew to associate them with anything unusual at all. When researchers finally sequenced DNA from these molars, the results confirmed that they, too, belonged to the same previously unknown Denisovan lineage, not to Neanderthals, not to modern humans. Dr. Benciviola, an anthropologist at the University of Toronto who worked on the analysis alongside the Max Planck team, described the significance plainly at the time. One of the teeth, when dated, turned out to be roughly 50,000 years older than the others, showing that this population, whatever it was, had persisted in this specific patch of Siberia for a genuinely long stretch of time rather than passing through briefly. Viola called the Denisovans humanity's long-lost cousins, distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals, but clearly related to both, having interbred with each in ways that left lasting genetic traces still detectable today, most prominently among modern Melanesian populations across the Pacific Islands, whose ancestors picked up a meaningful percentage of Denisovan ancestry through interbreeding at some point in the deep past. For years after that initial 2010 discovery, the picture stayed frustratingly incomplete in exactly this way. The genetic evidence for Denisovans was rock solid, but the physical evidence remained maddeningly sparse, limited to a handful of teeth and bone, fragments too incomplete to reconstruct much about what these people actually looked like, how they lived, or how widely across Asia they might have ranged. That changed considerably in 2019 when a research team returned to re-examine another tooth from the same cave. This one a worn baby molar belonging to a young Denisovan girl, and used careful, minimally destructive extraction techniques guided by 3D X-ray imaging to avoid damaging what little of the fossil remained to pull out a usable genetic sample. Dating placed this specific tooth in a sediment layer somewhere between roughly 128,000 and 227,000 years old, making it, at the time, one of the oldest confirmed human specimens ever recovered. From Central Asia, and pushing the confirmed presence of Denisovans in that specific region back by an additional 50,000 to 100,000 years, beyond what the earlier finds had shown. Researcher Viviana Slon, who led that analysis, noted that this extended timeline meant Denisovans had likely occupied the Altai region for a span of time comparable to, or possibly even longer, than the entire span modern humans have occupied Europe. A genuinely long-lived population hiding in plain sight for the better part of 200,000 years before science ever caught up to their existence. Here is where the story gets stranger still, because confirming that the Denisovans themselves were real and long-lived turned out to be only the first layer of the mystery, not the whole of it. As researchers sequenced more and more complete Denisovan genomes from the accumulating collection of bones and teeth recovered from the cave, they noticed something buried inside the Denisovan genetic code itself that didn't match anything else on record either. A portion of the Denisovan genome, researchers estimated somewhere around 4% of it, appeared to have come from an entirely separate, even older population, one that had diverged from the rest of the human family tree roughly 1 million years ago, considerably earlier than the split between Denisovans and Neanderthals and modern humans themselves. This even older, even more mysterious contributor came to be known among researchers as the super archaic ghost lineage, a population so far removed from anything in the confirmed fossil record that nobody could confidently say which known hominin species, if any, it actually belonged to. In other words, the Denisovans, who had themselves only recently been confirmed to exist through genetic detective work rather than physical discovery, turned out to be carrying, quietly, folded inside their own DNA, evidence of yet another ghost lineage, older and even more obscure than themselves, whose bones have never been confidently identified anywhere on Earth. Todd Disotel, a molecular anthropologist at New York University, described the growing pattern this evidence was revealing in blunt terms. It kept adding to a growing body of proof that our species and its close relatives had spent the better part of the last million years in close company with numerous other near relatives, most of whom left barely a physical trace behind, detectable now only as statistical echoes buried inside the genomes of the populations who once interbred with them. For years, the identity of this deeper, super-archaic ghost lineage remained essentially unsolvable, a mathematical certainty with no candidate skeleton to attach it to. That began to change only very recently in ways that are still actively unfolding as of 2026 through a genuinely clever workaround to the central problem that has always plagued attempts to study human origins in Asia specifically. DNA simply doesn't preserve reliably in most of the warmer, more humid environments where the relevant fossils tend to be found, which is exactly the same fundamental obstacle that has made deep African genetic research so difficult, and exactly the same obstacle that led researchers elsewhere to develop paleoproteomics, the technique of reading ancient protein fragments preserved in tooth enamel rather than relying on DNA itself as a workaround. In May of 2026, a research team led by geneticist Xiaomei Fu at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing applied exactly this kind of protein analysis to a set of Homo erectus teeth recovered from multiple Chinese archaeological sites, including a molar from the famous Zhoukoudian cave system near Beijing, originally excavated between 1949 and 1951, and additional teeth from a site called Sunjiadong, with a combined sample spanning an age of roughly 200,000 years to as much as 1.1 million years old. Analyzing the surviving amino acid sequences preserved in the ancient enamel, the team found that all 6 of the Homo erectus teeth they examined carried a specific protein variant that had never before been documented in any other known hominin population except one. It had already been identified in earlier research, specifically in Denisovans. Because this exact variant showed up consistently across every single Chinese Homo erectus specimen the team tested, spanning multiple sites and a considerable range of ages, the researchers concluded it most likely originated in populations closely related to Homo erectus itself, and that its presence inside the Denisovan genetic record most plausibly reflects some ancient episode of interbreeding, or at minimum close biological interaction between Denisovans and populations belonging to or descended from Homo erectus. Eduard Popp, a research scientist at the Naturalis Biodiversity Center in the Netherlands who was not directly involved in the study but reviewed its implications, put the significance plainly. Geneticists had already known Denisovans carried ancestry from an unidentified, deeply ancient ghost lineage with no confirmed genetic match anywhere in the fossil record, and Homo erectus had long been considered one plausible candidate for that missing U piece. This new protein evidence, Popp said, meaningfully strengthens that specific link. He was careful, though, to flag an important complication that keeps this discovery from being a fully closed case. Even using the closest chronological comparison available, there remains roughly a 100,000-year gap between the youngest of these Chinese Homo erectus specimens and the earliest confirmed Denisovan remains, a gap wide enough that a straightforward direct interbreeding event between the two populations, as commonly understood, isn't the only possible explanation. Popp raised a genuinely plausible alternative, that Denisovans might not have interbred with Homo erectus so much as evolved directly from a Homo erectus population, inheriting this specific protein variant the ordinary way, through direct ancestry, rather than picking it up through a separate mixing event between 2 distinct coexisting species. Xiaomei Fu herself was candid about the limits of what protein evidence alone can actually establish, noting that amino acid data recovered from ancient tooth enamel simply isn't detailed enough on its own to fully resolve exactly how these two populations relate to one another. Only recovering actual ancient DNA, rather than protein fragments, could ultimately provide that level of granular certainty, and DNA this old, from a hominin population this geographically dispersed across a region as warm and humid as most of China, remains an extraordinarily difficult, though not necessarily impossible, technical target for future researchers to pursue. Fu described the overall finding using a memorable phrase of her own: a stone thrown into a pool, creating a large splash and opening up considerably more new questions than it closes. Layered onto all of this, in an almost uncanny piece of timing, is a separate but closely related story that broke just a few months earlier in the final days of 2025, involving a skull that had spent more than 2 decades sitting, quite literally, hidden at the bottom of a well. In the year 2000, in Harbin, in northeastern China, a construction worker discovered an extraordinarily well-preserved ancient human skull and, for reasons that remain somewhat obscure even now, chose to conceal it at the bottom of a well rather than reporting it, where it sat undisturbed for nearly 2 decades before finally being handed over to researchers. Formally described in 2021 and given the popular nickname Dragon Man, alongside the formal scientific designation Homo longi, the skull presented researchers with a genuine puzzle showing a combination of primitive and startlingly modern features that didn't cleanly match any previously known hominin species. And when for years its exact place on the family, it's closer to a set of nested mysteries, each one uncovered by pursuing the last. A finger bone in 2008 revealed the existence of an entire population, the Denisovans, that nobody had previously known existed at all, detected purely through genetic sequencing. rather than physical resemblance. Teeth recovered from the very same cave, analyzed over the following decade, confirmed that this wasn't some brief, isolated occurrence, but a population that had persisted across the same patch of Siberia for close to 200,000 years. Buried inside the Denisovans' own genetic code, researchers then found unmistakable evidence of yet another ghost lineage, this one nearly 1 million years old, older than the Denisovans themselves, with no confirmed fossil ever definitively linked to it. And now, protein evidence extracted from ordinary Homo erectus teeth sitting in Chinese museum. Collections since the middle of the 20th century has begun to suggest, tentatively but with real scientific weight behind it, exactly which ancient population that deepest ghost lineage might trace back to, while a genuinely improbable skull recovered from a well is now understood to represent a face for one branch of this ghostly family tree that scientists spent over a decade knowing only through statistics. None of this, notably, is fully settled science, and the honest version of the story has to include that uncertainty rather than smoothing over it. The link between Homo erectus and the deepest Denisovan ghost ancestry remains, by the researchers' own careful description, a strengthened hypothesis rather than a proven fact, complicated by a real chronological gap. That leaves room for competing explanations, whether direct interbreeding between distinct coexisting populations or straightforward inherited ancestry from a Homo erectus population that gradually evolved into what we now call Denisovans. What is settled, confirmed across more than a decade of independent genetic and now protein-based research, is that the underlying phenomenon itself is real. Ancient humans were not a tidy sequence of species neatly replacing one another in an orderly line. They were a tangled, overlapping, frequently interbreeding web of related but genetically distinct populations, some of whom left behind confirmed skeletons, and some of whom, quite possibly including whole branches still completely unaccounted for, left behind nothing physical at all, surviving only as faint statistical echoes embedded inside the DNA of the populations who once mixed with them and eventually outlived them. That's the genuinely unsettling, genuinely fascinating part of this entire line of research, the part worth sitting with once all the technical detail settles. Every one of us alive today, depending on our specific ancestry, is quietly carrying small fragments of these vanished populations inside our own genomes. Tiny inherited signatures from Neanderthals, from Denisovans, and folded inside those from at least one deeper, still largely unidentified ghost lineage stretching back roughly 1 million years, whose bones may be sitting right now, misclassified or entirely unexamined, in a museum drawer somewhere, waiting for the right combination of protein analysis, genetic sequencing, and sheer scientific persistence to finally give them a name. A single 50,000-year-old tooth sitting quietly in a Siberian cave for millennia before anyone thought to look. Closely at it was enough to prove an entire vanished branch of humanity had existed all along. What that same tooth, and the ones that followed it, ultimately revealed is that the branch it belonged to wasn't even the end of the mystery. It was simply the first ghost that happened to be close enough to catch,